This is a lecture from Open Tuition. To benefit from the lecture, you should download the free lecture notes from opentuition.com.
Chapter 5 deals with the subject of management. And management can, as is here be defined as getting things done through people. And essentially what management is operating in is within an organisational context, whether profit-seeking or not profit-seeking. And if we go back to the definition of an organisation, it's a social arrangement for the controlled performance of collective goals. Management is therefore concerned with trying to get people to achieve these goals, or the organisation to achieve these goals in a controlled way. And what has become perhaps increasingly recognised as management theories have progressed is this business about it being a social arrangement, that organisations are ultimately composed of people, and we have our own preferences and fears and skills, and that has to be taken into account. Now, one of the first management writers, and we're talking here maybe at least 100 years ago, was Henri Fayol, and he thought management had these 5 functions. They do some planning, some organising, some commanding, some coordinating, and some controlling. In other words, you kind of plan for next year. You are going to organise people to do what you want, organise different teams perhaps. You've got to tell them what to do. You're going to coordinate them in some way so that whatever's produced can be dispatched and so on. And you'll be having some control there to make sure that people come in on time, that they work hard, that we don't order too much material and so on. And none of us would ever kind of object, I think, to any of these 5 functions of management. I think we might object more to what's missing here, and the sort of things which are missing is the idea of leadership, of maybe inspiring people, of motivating people, of maybe from time to time even dealing with people's fears, at maybe telling people or suggesting to people how they could do better. And this, these Fayol ideas, this is part of the classical school of management. And the classical school of management held the idea that there are specific correct ways of doing something. It's rather like classical architecture of the Greeks. Classical architecture of the Greeks held that if you have a building in a particular format, then it is automatically going to be pleasing to the eye, and that those particular proportions are the only way in which you should be constructing a building. They're always kind of saying and the classical theorists were saying there are golden rules of management, and these have to be followed. And we'll see that later on in the lecture, we'll see that things have freed up considerably, and we've kind of got to a situation which is known as contingent approaches, where if you ask someone what is the proper way to manage, you will get the reply, well, it depends. It depends on maybe the people you're managing and the task and so on. But way back, 1800s and so on, it was a very kind of almost dictatorial way. This is the way you should manage. Unfortunately, with many of these theories, knowing that these are the functions that you are going to be carrying on doesn't tell you when you should be doing it. You're not going to be saying, putting in your diary, right, from 9 to 10 I'll be doing some planning, and then from 10 to 11 I'll do a bit of organising and so on. And even though in theory managers might know they should be doing this, it doesn't mean they're going to do it very well or they're going to do it appropriately. So I'm always slightly dubious about whether management theory actually creates better managers. Again, around the time of Fayol, starting towards the end of the 1800s, Taylor had this idea of scientific management. Now, in the 1800s really, or until the 1800s, by and large there were no large manufacturing companies. Most sort of manufacturing was done with small family businesses. And in a way there was no idea of an organisation. There was no idea of almost a need for managers. you had you as a craftsman, you had your skills, and you kind of got on with it. And it was a rather novel idea of tailors that it is a function of managers to actually discover the best way in which tasks can be carried out, and to instruct the staff to do that so they become extremely efficient. And Taylor said you should do this by science. You should do really by experimenting. You should find out what is the best way of producing stuff. And the story is told, one of the studies he did, he looked at a variety of people called shovelers, and these people would be shoveling coal and iron ore and grain and so on. A shovel is. So they were kind of shoveling this stuff. And he worked out that maybe the optimum weight for shoveling is, let's say, 5 kilograms. You can keep going all day. It's not going to damage your back or something of that sort. So what he says is, if you were, say, shoveling iron ore, which is very dense, give somebody a relatively small shovel, but it will hold about 5 kilograms. But if you're shoveling, sawdust or something of that sort, which is relatively light, if you like, then you give them a big shovel, but in both situations you're going to get about 5 kilograms onto it. And the idea was that managers would then tell their staff how to do the job, in other words, not just letting the staff kind of muddle through. And the hope was that the extra productivity would create extra financial reward, not just for the organisation, the employer, but also the employees. So there was going to be higher productivity, there's going to be essentially higher wages and so on. He was also very keen on care programs and looking after workers and training them, and perhaps dealing with injuries and so on properly. But unfortunately what happened was that much of what he discovered was that the most efficient way of doing something, a big task, is to break it down into very small tasks, and let every person specialise in a small task. And then when Henry Ford came along in, let's say, the 1920s, he, of course, invented really the mass production line, where people were standing in one place every day, just kind of, doing the same thing over and over again to create the car. And the idea was really then developed that Taylor fell into almost disrepute, that he was blamed for dehumanizing work, for taking skills out of it, for making people stand there and do these repetitive, very non-rewarding tasks, really. But it has to be remembered, really, that his heart was in the right place. He was trying to improve the lot of the workforce, and maybe the way his ideas were later interpreted and used was where the dehumanization came in. Around 1935, when we have a jump now maybe of 20 years since Taylor, we had the beginning of the Human Relations School. And the Human Relations School is where, maybe for the first time, we begin to recognize that there's more to commanding people than just giving them orders. And it has to be remembered that when you get back to the first of these very large manufacturing companies, in many ways the only large or equivalently large organizations that had been previously were military organizations, army, navies, where of course it was very much giving people orders and expecting them to be obeyed. Hawthorne, the Hawthorne studies here by Mayo, this was a plant of a large electrical manufacturer in America. Of course, back then, 1930s, nearly everything was manual and so on. And what he did various things, but one of the experiments he did was he split a workforce into two in a particular, I think it was called a wiring room or something. And it was split them into two kind of buildings almost. And in one building he kept the light constant, and in another building he would change the lighting, make it brighter, make it dimmer, etc. And he would measure the output from the two sets of workers. And in the building where he was putting the light up and down, he would go and ask people, do you prefer this light or that light, and so on. And the results he came out with were a bit surprising, that almost no matter what you did with the lights, even if you made it really kind of gloomy, the productivity of that experimental group was always better than the control group, where you just kept the lights constant. And the interpretation of this was that by going and asking these people, do you prefer this lighting or that lighting? Have you any ideas maybe how to improve the lighting? They would respond to that in a very favourable way. They felt valued. They felt they were actually able to kind of participate and contribute towards their working conditions, and this increased productivity. So rather than just telling people to get on with it, shut up, sit down, work hard, maybe a more participative approach is going to give considerable benefits. He also discovered in a slightly different experiment was that there are inevitably there are groups evolve, and these are what are called informal groups. Now, management can create what are called formal groups, like a team or a committee, but these are informal groups. It's basically probably the people you're just working with. And these informal groups would develop what they call group norms. In other words, they would kind of almost, they wouldn't sit down and talk about it, but what would evolve was an acceptable way of working, an acceptable rate of working. And if management wanted to increase the productivity of these people, then they would all kind of almost automatically band together and resist the increase in productivity, maybe until they all sort of agreed that the rate of pay that was being offered was appropriate. And it was very difficult. People liked this kind of in with colleagues in the group, and people were very reluctant to break out of the group, because once you broke out of the group, then you're kind of cast aside almost by your friends, and you're going to in really quite an uncomfortable time. And it seems odd now, but really management hadn't been aware of these very strong informal groups and norms which could interfere potentially with the function of management. And you maybe have to address whole groups of people rather than trying to address individuals. Now, Drucker, another manager, and I must apologise, this chapter has a lot of management theorists. There are probably more management theorists in existence than is actually good for the world. And they all come out with their theory. It allows them to write a book and to get a PhD and a professorship and so on. And many of the theories kind of overlap quite a bit, and they're just given a slightly different twist, slightly different name, and so on. But I'm afraid you have to kind of, at some point, try to learn the names and learn really what ideas these people had. So we're not going to, we're not going to beat it to death too much in the lecture because it's getting boring. It's something you'll have to sit down and try and commit to memory, really. But it's worth talking here about style theory, because again, going way back before this, people talked about trait theory, or even before that, what makes a good leader, a good manager, and people thought at one stage you were born to it. You are the king or the king's son, and because you are the king's son, you will inherit the throne and you will be a natural leader, sort of an idea. And then there was, certainly during the First World War, the idea of an officer class, a particular set of families almost. And if you were born into these families, then you had kind of natural leadership sort of ability. So you either inherited this or you didn't. And then it moved on to something which was called trait theory, which was trying to identify what makes maybe a leader. Are they somebody who's nearly 2 meters tall? Do they tend to have predominantly, blonde hair, blue eyes, or whatever it is? Do have a particular kind of body mass index or something? Are there traits that would almost measurable characteristics that would allow us to identify who's going to be a good manager and a good leader? And that didn't really work either. There was no worthwhile correlation, really. And it came down then to style theory, which is kind of where we are now. That what makes a good leader or a good manager is your style, how you behave. And Drucker had the idea, first of all, what does management do? And Drucker said you have to manage really three things. There is the business, for example, you have to make sure you're trying to get the profit. You have to manage your other managers, so you have to do a lot of coordination in there for the different departments and so on. And then you have to make sure the workforce is properly managed as well, getting proper pay, proper discipline, etc., etc. And you then broke it down into 5 categories. You want to set people objectives, and that's fine. You want to organize the groups, the departments, if you like. And here, very importantly, almost for the first time, we didn't have this in Fayol. We had it coming in, though, in the social approach, the Mayo approach and the Hawthorne experiments. We had the social approach to management. We have motivating and communicating. This is where this begins to make an appearance. This is part of the management function. And we would measure performance. There would presumably be control in there somewhere, there's to be organising. And you want to develop people. And again, there's an element of social stuff in there. The people might actually respond quite favourably if you were to send them on a training course, or if you were to provide coaching for them on the job and so on. He saw within styles, within the style theory, that the managers had then 3 roles. We had these 3 levels we have here: managing the business, managers, workers, and the work. We've got the 5 categories here. But then he said there are these 3 particular roles that you have to pay attention to. An interpersonal role arising from basically formal authority that you have because you're called a manager. People will, for example, look to you for leadership. They will expect you to be their leader, to tell you what to do, to maybe be a figurehead for them, and so on. There's going to be an information processing role where you monitor maybe how the business is doing, how the orders for sales are coming in. You will disseminate, spread that information to people who need to know, discuss it with them, and so on. And you may also be a spokesperson for your department. You'll represent your department. And finally, there are decisional roles, making significant decisions, maybe to improve the output, maybe to settle disputes. That's disturbance handler. Deciding, am I going to buy this new machine or that new machine because we can't afford both, and so on. Maybe negotiating not only with employees but customers and suppliers as well. So quite a lot of stuff there on Drucker, the various things to manage, the categories which we have here, and then the interpersonal information processing and decisional roles which managers are expected to fulfill. Ashridge. Now, Ashridge is a management college in the south of England. It's not a person. And Ashridge looked at the management styles, or leadership styles, if you like. And basically they saw a kind of continuum here. Some managers will tell you what to do. You could say that this is a very kind of dictatorial. This is the boss, they tell you what to do. It's really sometimes called autocratic. They just tell you what to do and expect you to get on with it, kind of blind obedience. And then there's cells, which is basically they tell you what to do and try to convince you why it's right, try to explain why it's right. But there's no real participation in it. There is consults. Consults is where they would ask your opinion, but after hearing your opinion and you discussing stuff and so on, the manager would make the decision. And then there's joins, or joins with, it's sometimes called, and this is really the full democratic style. And it's almost management abandoning its function. Management in an extreme example of this democratic style would just ask people always to take a vote. And as I say, there's a kind of continuum in these styles from very dictatorial to very kind of participative and democratic. Now we'll see, if you ask which of these is right, really this is beginning to get into kind of contingency theory, and they would say there's not one of them is always right. For example, it would depend maybe on the urgency of the decision. So if you are running out of cash, then you just have to tell people you will not spend any more money, you will not recruit any more people. You haven't got the luxury of going through the discussions and the participation and so on. On the other hand, if you were organising a staff party, you might go all the way down to the kind of democratic area here, and you could say to your staff members, look, here's the budget, and you decide amongst yourselves where you want to go for the staff party. It also depends a little bit maybe on the sort of people you're managing. So if you are managing highly trained graduates, engineers, for example, and you try to go in and you just tell them this is what you have to do, they're probably going to rebel about that because much of their educational background is they expect to put forward their ideas, they expect to argue their case and for people to listen and respond and so on. You need to be much more down here if you're dealing with highly skilled, highly qualified people. But then there are some people who actually just want to go and do a job, a kind of simple job, not worry about it, go in the morning, be told what to do, get on with it, go home and not worry about it. And they would rather be told what to do, because once you get down here, they might actually get a little bit nervous. Oh, my boss is asking me my opinion, what happens if I give the wrong opinion? And what happens if we make the wrong decision? I'm then exposed to risk. And they would rather just have this comfortable lifestyle. So it's we would say horses for courses, you know. There is no guaranteed place in this continuum which is going to be right for all companies, all organizations, all staff, for all decisions for all time. We have to be flexible. Blake and Mouton, they produced their grid here, and it was originally used as a kind of self-diagnostic tool to help managers decide where they're good, where they're bad, and where they ought to kind of move to. And they said really they were going to measure two things about the manager. First of all, their concern for people. Some managers are very anxious to make sure that you're kind of happy in your work and you're not under too much stress and so on here. So as you go up here, they're very concerned with their staff. Probably a very nice manager, a very pleasant person to be managed by. And then also there's a concern for the task here. Are you going to come in on budget? Are you going to get the work done and so on? Maybe a slightly kind of harsher approach there. And I got people through questionnaires kind of mapping out where on this grid they were, their concern for people and their concern for the task. So if we go up here, this lovely kind of 1, 9, it's like a graph if you like, X is 1, Y is 9 here. This lovely saying here, a country club management style. So think of a country club, a place you go for leisure, so to speak. And here the manager is delightful, will do nearly anything you want, but hardly gives any attention whatsoever to how good the results are. And that's not great. It's not great for the long term. Lovely manager, but you're going broke. Out here you have a very authoritarian style. This would be a really tough person to be managed by. This person probably really unfair with you, a real kind of slave driver. All they care about is, getting the sales target, getting the profit target and so on. And they don't care if it ruins your family life or You have to work to 11 every night and have a nervous breakdown and so on. This is the ideal up here. Great concern for people, and at the same time you can also get great concern for the task. You get the tasks accomplished, and your employees love you. This is the perfect manager, really. We have middle of the road, sort of averagely good in both areas here, and then we have the useless person down here. No good with people, no good with the task. This is described as an impoverished management style. So the idea was, if you kind of plot your graph and you find you're here through your questionnaires, you say, well, you're pretty good on managing people, but actually you need to be maybe a little bit harder sometimes about getting the task. What you need to do is try to change your management style slightly, so that you are getting more towards this kind of perfection, which is up here. We've had Ashridge as well, haven't we? So, Adair. Adair is famous, and you have to just know this, for action-centered leadership. What actions really should managers take? And Adair said you have to show concern for individuals. This is a human relations type concern. People will look for involvement with you and your problems and your ambitions and so on. You have to show concern for the group, so managing the group as a whole to make sure that it's, say, properly resourced, enough time, knows what it's going to be doing and so on. And you have to have concern for the task. So individuals, group and task, action-centered leadership. And Adair was saying, a manager has to spend his or her time, without telling them when to do it, but you have to make sure you look after individuals, you look after the group, you look after the task. And this quite complex kind of balancing exercise is what Adair said made for good managers. Without, again, guaranteeing that if you know this in theory, you're actually going to be a good manager. Because we know some people would maybe show great concern for individuals, but they're not very good at kind of cracking the whip, so to speak, and making sure the tasks actually get accomplished. Handy is certainly a contingency theory person. Charles Handy, he had a best fit theory. And this is quite nice. This is contingency theory, saying how you manage depends on how you as an individual maybe naturally manage. It depends on how your subordinates expect to be managed. It depends on the task, and it depends on the environment. So if we start, and these can all vary, okay. So if we start at the tight here, if you are what's called a tight leader, this means that you are kind of naturally a dictator. You're kind of naturally a little Adolf Hitler, really. So you like giving people orders, and you expect them to be obeyed, and you are blessed with subordinates who like being given orders and who like obeying. So that's a good fit. And you're given tasks which are very routine, very repetitive, very easily understood. So you can be pretty confident if I give the order and they follow it out, the task will be accomplished. And the environment is maybe one where we have to be maybe very careful of the money, very kind of short of money, so we have to do things efficiently. And if everything's lining up here, it's going to be very good. I'm a bit of a dictator. You like being told what to do. We all understand the task, which is very repetitive and has to be done efficiently without any, fiddling about, so to speak, and wasting time. That's a good fit. On the other hand, we might have a leader who is naturally a much more kind of participative person, kind of shies away from telling people what to do, would rather go up to people and say, well, what do you think? And you have subordinates who expect to be consulted because they are, highly skilled, highly trained and so on, and they would be affronted if they weren't consulted. And the task is complex, it's novel, we've never tried it before. the leader couldn't tell you how to do it. The leader actually needs to gather in knowledge from the subordinates, from staff, so they really problem solve to achieve the task. And the environment is one where they have to have the time and the money and maybe the freedom to experiment, so that they get this novel, complex task done successfully. And that all fits as well. Everyone's kind of lined up, you know. He said where you get into trouble is if there's a kind of crossover somewhere. So if you had your very tight manager in charge of very highly skilled, independently minded subordinates who were asked to do very repetitive tasks kind of very quickly, he said that's not going to work. In particular, there'll be great rebellion here, this manager telling these very skilled people what to do, and then they're going to get really fed up very quickly with being set to do this kind of routine, boring task. He said that won't work. Nor would it work, you know, any crossover is going to be a problem here, any crossover. Nor is it going to work the other way if you have a very kind of laid-back sort of leader who wants to get people's opinions, and this laid-back leader is put in charge of subordinates who prefer to be told what to do, and this laid-back leader comes and says, well, what do you think? The subordinates will almost think there's a trap being laid, you know. I'm going to say the wrong thing, I'm going to get into trouble, and so on. And then certainly if they are given a task which is unique, never been tried before, these people will feel very unsettled, very nervous, very unsure of themselves, and that was not going to work either. So when you say how should the leader manage, for example, or how should you maybe construct a team, there is no right answer. The variables, it's the leader, the subordinates, the task, and the environment. You have to get them consistent, really, with each other to get a good fit. Bennis here, the big thing about Bennis was really a distinction between a manager and a leader. And the distinction really is, managers are, what shall we say? Managers are not, maybe in his view, not very exciting, you know. Managers are concerned with making sure we get this month's sales figures right. They're making sure that there's enough staff who come in and so on. They administer, they maintain, they focus on making sure the systems are working properly. Relatively short-term view, tend to be focusing on, you know, this month or this year's results and so on. They're very necessary to keep things, you know, working efficiently, but they're not really going to inspire anything. And he contrasted that with a leader, a very inspirational person who is willing to take the longer-term view and maybe change things more radically. And sometimes you have businesses which run into a bit of trouble because the chief executive officer simply doesn't have the inspiration, doesn't have the vision about what's needed to make this business really turn round. And then you suddenly bring in a new CEO who is a visionary and who really changes it around. And I suppose we're looking for a current example, current time example. He's unfortunately died now, but Steve Jobs. So Steve Jobs seemed to have this charisma that when he was brought back into Apple, he turned it around and made it one of the, or if not the most successful company in the world. And this person was very much transformational, you know, doing the right thing. Whereas a transactional manager or a transactional leader is much more concerned with doing the current things, but doing them correctly. The transformational person is willing to think outside the box, really, and take a more radical view. Bennis looked at the qualities of great leaders. You're talking about here great leaders and not great managers. Suggested they have integrity, a certain honesty about them. They're very dedicated to the job in hand, to the work. They spend huge amounts of time on it. They are magnanimous. In other words, if somebody else is responsible for a good idea, they will give credit. Nobody is going to be very inspired by a leader who takes all the credit for themselves. A certain amount of humility, recognizing that they are part of an organization and that the team is the one who is maybe ultimately responsible for getting things done. Openness with people, telling both good news and bad news, not misleading and so on. And creativity, being willing to be transformational, maybe taking a bit of a risk, is what he said were the main characteristics of these inspirational, charismatic leaders. Fiedler said managerial effectiveness depends on two elements. First of all, there is the leadership style which you adopt, and we would say that there's no correct leadership style. You could be very task orientated, very non-participative, to the other extreme, very participative, very human relations there, and also what was called situational favourableness, the degree to which the particular situation that they're in gives the leader control or influence. So, for example, if the situation you're in is that the company's making losses and everyone knows it's running out of money, it's in trouble, this gives the leader quite a bit of power, because everyone knows if we don't do something, the thing is going to fail. And the leadership style that might be appropriate there is just to tell people what to do. In other situations where the company seems to be very, very successful, and maybe people get almost slightly rebellious, so to speak, are maybe willing to go on strike to get pay rises, then you're not quite in such a maybe favourable situation to impose your will as a manager. Maybe we have to become more kind of task orientated there, rather than telling people you will take this pay rise. Maybe you have to become kind of more negotiating and so on. Otherwise, there's going to be great industrial unrest and so on. And here he also suggested three things are important. The relationship between the leader and the followers is a relationship, say, of trust and respect in both ways, or is it something inferior to that? The structure of the task, whether it's a simple task and maybe you can just tell people what to do, so almost getting back to the handy best fit. And the position power. Position power is always your title. So if you are the CEO, then you are likely to find it more easily to impose your will than if you're simply a supervisor. Positional power comes from your ranking and your title really within the organization. And high-ranked people are almost in a more favorable position automatically, simply because of their title. And finally, we have just four little definitions to be looking at here: power, authority, responsibility, and delegation. So power is the ability to influence people or events. And the normal sources of power are as follows. There is reward power, where you say to somebody or you imply to somebody, if you do what I say, then you will get a pay rise, you will get a bonus, or you get a promotion. And we all know that our bosses have some reward power there, even if it's not boldly stated. We know that we depend on them maybe for recommendations for our next job and so on. There is rational legal power, and rational legal power is the power that a manager has simply because the manager is called manager. It's really an implied part of your contract of employment that you do what you're told by supervisors and managers. You might not respect this person, you might not like them, but you do what you're told because they are called manager. There is charismatic power. Charismatic power comes from really the force of personality. These are people, great leaders really, and you kind of follow them across hot coals. You always die for them because you hold them in such esteem. And that can be quite separate from rational legal power. And indeed, sometimes charismatic power can lead people astray. You have a very charismatic, maybe trade union leader who leads people out on strike and actually leads the workforce into considerable difficulties. There is knowledge power. This is the person who comes from IT and gets your computer working again. You are beholden to them. Probably won't tell you how to do it yourself. They would want to retain that power. And there is a saying, knowledge is power. And then finally there is coercive power, which in most organizations we don't come across too much, but that's really the power of force, almost physical force. And you come across that sort of power more in maybe institutions like jails and so on. As I say, thankfully not very often in ordinary organizations, profit-seeking organizations. Now, there can be a bit of a dispute then between power and authority. Authority is the right to exercise power, and that's really what we want. And of course, some of these types of power don't give you the right to exercise it. Charismatic power doesn't mean you should be exercising that power. You might be undermining your proper rational legal manager by exercising that power. Knowledge power does not necessarily give you the right to exercise power. It doesn't give you the right to withhold the knowledge and keep that element of power to yourself and so on. And quite obviously coercive power is not always right. So, because you don't do what a manager says, the manager comes and hits you, very few businesses would they have the authority to hit you. So authority is what we're looking for in managers, the right to exercise power. And then there is responsibility, and responsibility is effectively like accountability. It's really saying the buck stops here. So if you are responsible for something, you can never get rid of that. Okay? If you're responsible for something, whatever way you decide to achieve that outcome, that's your decision, and you'll remain accountable for that. And this is an important distinction because when you come to delegate, in other words, telling your subordinates to do something for you, you will never get rid of responsibility. You can never pass responsibility to them. If your subordinate messes up, you can't, as a manager, saying it wasn't me, it was him. Well, you're the person who chose that person, that subordinate. Maybe you chose the wrong person without the skills, or maybe you didn't give them enough guidance, or maybe you didn't keep your eye on them. But you decided not to do it yourself. You decided to give it to that person. You can't pass the responsibility. You can pass the authority to that person. They have a right to do something, to exercise power, but you can never divest yourself of responsibility that's been given to you.
This is a lecture from Open Tuition. To benefit from the lecture, you should download the free lecture notes from opentuition.com.